please tell us a little bit about yourself, your tech background, and what do you do now?
I'd love to, and thank you for having me on. So I've been working for all of my career in the tech industry, mostly here in Ireland. Not as a developer, actually. So I started off as a product manager and in some startups here. And in about 2003, I joined Microsoft Ireland well, first of all, to be working in their, what they later called their developer experience department, but it was essentially doing community outreach to developer and technical audiences. And then I headed up that department from about 2007, or no, maybe 2009. We're counting back now. But I was always involved in reaching out to communities, developer communities, and we had been responsible for getting, helping them to adopt the latest Microsoft technologies. And it was through Microsoft actually that I became aware of open source. And certainly in my latter days in Microsoft Ireland, we in the developer experience group were very big in terms of promoting how Microsoft had very much changed its stance with regard to open source. And then and in those later years when I was in Microsoft, were very active in promoting the idea of open source on Azure at the time. And I suppose I had been aware of open source at that period of time, but I'd never really experienced any open source community. So when I left Microsoft in 2017, and at that time, I was very interested in actually kind of thinking more about. I had observed that an awful lot of the work that we had done as kind of pilot projects never really got adopted broadly. And I started looking into this idea of how technology gets adopted and organizational trends and even how technology in general gets built and thinking more about that kind of organizational and cultural aspect to software development. And around that time, I started working for an organization called Nearform, who are based in the south of Ireland. And that organization was interesting because they were the first group of folks that I worked with that were actively involved in the open source communities. And it was through them that I began to understand a little bit more about, I suppose, the potential for open source more broadly in the corporate sector, and how it was being used. I mean, it really did change my perceptions about open source, just even learning about who they engaged with and how open source is both being used and why it was being created. And also at Nearform, I happened to meet a woman called Denise Cooper, who was one of the founders of the InnerSource Commons community. And InnerSource, of course, is the use of open source methods inside organizations to create proprietary code, often as a pathway to open source, but sometimes just as a way to break down silos and help collaboration. And I was fascinated by how this was actually enabling collaboration because for me, it came down to the fact that I thought that people were actually pretty bad at collaborating and kind of communicating around technology. I had been working with Denise around this idea of how to enable inner source in companies, and became fascinated by just how much open source methods and culture could really change and help organizations. So when I left Nearform, I started working actually with InnerSource Commons, and that was in 2020. Denise asked me to come and start working for the InnerSource Commons community. And I was helping them at that time because two things were happening. First of all, the pandemic. So they had to move all their operations online and virtual. And that was a big shift for them as an organization. But secondly, they were beginning to form as a foundation. So before that, they were just a community, and then they incorporated as a 501(c)(3). I was the executive director then there for 2 years. And it was through that community that I did my first open source contribution, because InnerSource Commons itself is an open source project. So then I became an open source contributor. Um, mostly in terms of not code. It was in terms of actually adding contributions to the website itself and the knowledge around inner source. But it was still incredibly exciting to actually get my first contribution accepted. My first pull request accepted. It was fantastic. And I think it was through that community I met a lot of folks who were involved in open source program offices, and I became more aware of the broader potential for open source to have economic and social impact. So it was from that work that I just gradually found my way into more open source communities where folks were thinking about, in particular, how do we systemize and operationalize the whole idea of open source within organizations, both private sector and then public sector in particular. So in more recent years, I've been working more around open source program offices in the public sector, and particularly in universities and research institutions globally. So mostly in the States, a couple in Europe. And I myself joined the academic community just last year. I decided to start a PhD, and I am currently a researcher with the University of Galway here in Ireland, though I'm based in Dublin. Along the way, I set up Open Ireland Network because I was trying to promote the whole idea of open source in Ireland at a national level. And yeah, that's been my later years. So a roundabout path to get to open source. Perhaps not as long a history in open source as many people, but I'm delighted to be here. So that's been my journey so far.